tutorial, I'm going to be showing you how to make your own butter icing and then techniques you can use to pipe butter icing onto your cupcakes. Now you can buy butter icing ready-made from shops, but it's always good to learn how to make your own from scratch so you can experiment with flavours and colours. So all I'm doing here is mixing up room temperature butter with icing sugar, and that effectively forms the basis of my butter icing. I recommend cutting up your butter into small pieces. This makes it a lot easier to mix together. Now, you do need a lot of patience for this process. My butter is a little bit colder than I'd like to have been, and so it's taken a little while to break down in the bowl. So I'm using the back of a spoon to mix the butter icing against the wall of the bowl, trying to get an even spread so that I have a nice light creamy butter icing. Now you can do this by hand like I am, or you could use a whisk. You could even use an electric whisk. I do find with the whisks it makes a little bit of mess. Eventually you'll get to a stage where your butter icing looks like this. You've got a nice yellow, pale yellow, creamy texture. When you've cooked your cupcakes, you need to make sure that they cool down on a wire rack so that they don't continue to cook in the baking tray. And then we're ready to start decorating them. It's important that the cakes are fully cooled down before you start icing them, because if you place the icing on them when they're too warm, the icing is going to melt and break down. It won't hold its shape very well. Now this first one I'm going to show you how to decorate just using a palette knife. So we're just putting a little bit of the icing on the cake and then trying to smooth it out as much as possible on the cake. Now you can see straight away, I said earlier about my butter being a little bit too cold, and that's making it a little bit trickier for me to manipulate around the cake. So I would recommend, before you decorate your cakes or even make your butter icing, is leaving your butter to stand in room temperature for a little while. It will make it a lot easier. As you can see, I very nearly lost this cake to little hands. So now the trickier part, this is piping cakes. Now you might have a piping bag or a disposable bag like I've got here. The first thing you're going to need to do with a disposable bag is snip off the very tip so that you can fit your nozzles through. Now you want to cut the hole too small to begin with. If you cut it too big, then the piping nozzle is just going to slip straight through the bag. So you better to go too small and then take off excess as you go. Now I always find using a pint glass is really helpful for this technique, because when you start to fill your bag up with your icing, it acts as another pair of hands, so it keeps everything stable for you whilst you fill the bag up. So you place the piping bag inside the pint glass and then pull the edges over. This way you can get your icing down into the piping bag as far as possible. And I'm just using the palette knife to pop some butter icing in, and I'm actually going to show you how to create a two-tonal effect with the butter icing. So I've put some of my yellow creamy butter icing into the glass, but I've tried to keep it over to one side of the piping bag, and now I've added a bit of food gel into the remainder of the butter icing in my bowl, and I'm mixing it in together. Now I've kind of shortcutted it here, but if you wanted to create different colours of butter icing, what you would do is separate your butter icing into smaller bowls and then mix up those bowls in advance. The quantities on the recipe in your workbook create enough butter icing for 12 cakes, but obviously this is really dependent on how much butter icing you put onto each cake. If you have loads of butter icing on each one, then obviously it won't go as far. Once your butter icing's in your piping bag, you want to ease it down towards the nozzle and twist the top of it so that when you start piping, the icing doesn't come out the top of the bag. This is a tricky skill and it can take a bit of practice, so don't be disheartened if it doesn't go right the first time. Now I start using a star-shaped nozzle, and I start from the outside of the cake and I'll swirl it towards the middle of the cake, building it up, a bit like an ice cream. And as you go, you might find that you need to tighten the bag so that you push more of the icing down. Now I tend to use my stronger hand, my right hand, to hold the top of the bag, and then my left hand to control the nozzle. You might find it easier as well to have a second pair of hands hold the cake still for you whilst you are working on it. It really is a case of practice makes perfect, and as you work through your batch of cupcakes, you'll probably find that the last cakes look much better than your first cakes. And once you've piped them, you might want to add on some other decorations, for example, some sprinkles like I'm doing here. So why don't you have a go with experimenting with colour in your butter icing, and have a good go at piping your own batch of fairy cakes.